All right, hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, and today we will be discussing Federalist number 26. If this is your first time attending a Federalist read-along, what we do is we go through each and individual Federalist paper and we go line by line through that 18th century language, see if we can't dissect it and understand what it was Misters Hamilton, Madison, and sometimes John Jay were talking about. This time it is Federalist number 26, and we will be once again discussing Alexander Hamilton. Or actually, Hamilton will be doing the discussing, we'll be doing the analysis of what he has to say. That being said, if you are new here, make sure you hit like, and if you want to subscribe, come every Tuesday to our read-alongs. Well, that'd be just fantastic. As for me, this is week 5 since I've shaved my beard, and now you know how long it took me to grow that thing in the first place. If I'm having any problems with the sound or visuals, we had some problems last week. YouTube saying there might be some problems. If there are, please let me know. I would love to remedy that. I'm not entirely sure why it is saying that, but I guess we'll just have to go with it. The stream's bitrate is lower than recommended, 4,500. So bear with me one moment here. We'll check it out. We'll see why it might be saying that. Its minimum is 4,500 output. Oh, okay. I don't know if it will let me change this along the way, but there we go. I changed it. Changed it to 4,500 as it recommended. So, off we go. I'm going to bounce over here. Without further ado, we're going to bounce right over here. Alex, thank you for letting me know everything's good, and thank you so much for hanging out. Let's get right into this. So, Federalist number 26, with a fantastic title, The Idea of Restraining the Legislative Authority in Regard to the Common Defense Considered. So, as a refresher, the last two Federalist papers, Hamilton spoke largely about the national defense and the need for a strong national defense being the number one priority of a confederated government or any government of the United States. Additionally, he very briefly said, I believe it was in 24, that the government should be able to do whatever means necessary. And in 25, he spoke about some arguments regarding restraining the legislature's ability to do quite literally anything in order to get the, as he says here, common defense or the Army and Navy going and powerful enough to at least defend the United States, if not one day in the future be aggressors. He never says that outright, but that's what happens. We've studied history. For the Independent Journal, of course, one of two New York newspapers that they basically rotate the Federalist papers in, December 22nd, 1787. So one day after Federalist number 26, and again, Alexander Hamilton. So let's see what Mr. Hamilton has to say to the people of the state of New York. As always, these were published in New York. Sentence number the first. And again, these are Hamilton's capitals, not mine. He is the one punctuating here. And additionally, I would also throw out there that while I have read these several times in my life, it's been a while, so it's a little bit of a fresh read along for me. So let's learn together. It was a thing hardly to be expected that in a popular revolution, the minds of men should stop at that happy mean which marks the salutary boundary between power and privilege, and combines the energy of government with the security of private rights. So what we're saying here is, after the Revolutionary War went through, we'll be a little bit surprised that we stop between power and privilege, and combines the energy of government with the security of private rights. So the power is the government, the ability to do things, and the privilege is the private rights, the rights of the individual. And we need to find, as most of the founders did agree on, one of the few things they all seem to agree on is we needed to find some kind of balance between individual liberty and the power of a government. Let's see. A failure in this delicate and important point is the great source of the inconveniences we experience, and if we are not cautious to avoid a repetition of the error in our future attempts to rectify and ameliorate our system, we may travel from one chimerical project to another. We may try change after change, but we shall never be likely to make any material change for the better. So that's a lot. So let's take that a little bit at a time. the reason that there were so many problems at the time, and there were many problems at the time under the Articles of Confederation, he's saying here it is because they didn't find the right balance between the government's power and the rights of the individual citizens. We need to be careful not to keep repeating that. He seems to think they erred a bit on the side of individual liberty when they should be a little bit closer to power in the government. In our future attempts to rectify and ameliorate our system, we may we may try change after change. We can try to fix, but we might not ever actually correct the problem by just throwing band-aids on it. So, he gets into it. The idea of restraining the legislative authority in the means of providing for the national defense is one of those refinements which owe their origin to a zeal for liberty more ardent than enlightened. So the idea that the Congress can only have so much power for the national defense. Again, Hamilton in the previous two papers had argued that there should be unlimited power by the national government for defense. Many people were scared of this, as we've mentioned. Many people today are maybe a bit hesitant towards standing armies. He's saying here that the idea that there should be limits on what the Congress can do when it comes to raising and paying for an army and a navy, we've gotten a little too far on the side of liberty, or what he said, privilege, earlier. And he says they're more ardent than enlightened. So the people's desire for their rights to be protected he's acknowledging, are justified, but maybe we've gone a little too crazy when it comes to supporting our rights. Again, we're not going to get into the Bill of Rights until the very last paper, which isn't actually published until the Constitution is ratified. So Hamilton is not really a proponent of a Bill of Rights in particular. He thinks that maybe we need to give up some more of our rights for the greater good. So if I sound like a communist, this is Hamilton's thinking, not my own. This is quite a sentence here. Let's get through it. We have seen, however, that it is not... Let me try again. We have seen, however, that it has not had thus far an extensive prevalence, that even in this country, where it made its first appearance, Pennsylvania and North Carolina are the only two states by which it has been in any degree patronized, and that all the others have refused to give it the least countenance, wisely judging that confidence must be placed somewhere, that the necessity of doing it is implied in the very act of delegating power, and that it is better to hazard the abuses of that confidence than to embarrass the government and endanger the public safety by impolitic restrictions on the legislative authority. That's a mouthful. Essentially, he is referencing the Bills of Rights that we were just discussing. Pennsylvania and North Carolina were the only two states, as he said in previous papers, that had real Bills of Rights that specifically stated, many states had Bills of Rights, but they're the only two that specifically stated that standing armies could not be kept up in times of peace. All the rest of the state governments, he's saying here, which does seem to be true, they at least acknowledge that some kind of military force should be kept up just in case, or at least could be kept up just in case. And the really interesting here is they have wisely judging confidence must be placed somewhere. You have to trust someone to do some governing sometimes. And again, I try not to talk about modern politics here. And when this was being written, the idea of anarchy in any fashion really wasn't a thing. The word was barely around, and when it was, it did simply mean chaos. It wasn't a political theory as we might reference it nowadays. So no one disagreed with the idea that we need some kind of government somewhere. And to be honest, most people today would probably agree that we need some kind of government somewhere. And that's what he's saying here. And that the necessary of doing it is the very act of delegating power. The fact that we have a government, whatever government the states have, whether we have the federal government, the national government, or whether we have the Articles of Confederation, we need to have some kind of government somewhere. And the idea that you do that means you're placing trust in that government And really, one of the main reasons for government is the protection of the people, for people's safety. Despite whatever level an individual might believe that safety should be, whatever amount of power should be given to enforce that safety, and whatever the laws are regarding that safety, it needs to be placed somewhere. And now, kind of going off on a tangent here, but it's a really important point to Hamilton's entire argument. Across the board with all the Federalist Papers, most of the Federalist argument regarding the Constitution kind of at least find their foundation here. We need a government somewhere, and we need to set a baseline of what we want a government to do. And most of the American founders did agree that they needed some kind of union for common defense. That was the whole point of the Continental Congress in the first place, the whole point of the Continental Army, despite by this point primarily having been dismissed. And this is also important. It is better to hazard the abuse of that confidence than to embarrass the government and endanger the public safety. So it's better to, he's saying it's better to risk having an abusive government with enough power to defend the people than to have a weak government that will never be abusive to the people, but also probably can't protect it. It's a foundational argument, not even argument, a debate when it comes to early American political theory. And again, the thing about the Federalist Papers is this is essentially the foundation of American political theory being laid out by some of the main architects of that government. So he's chosen his side. Let's hear him talk about it. The opponents of the proposed Constitution combat, in this respect, the general decision of America. And instead of being taught by experience the propriety of correcting any extremes into which we may have heretofore run, they appear to dispose to conduct us in others still more dangerous and more extravagant. So, the Anti-Federalists, he's claiming here, they are throwing off what we've learned about America. They're throwing off what we know historically. They're throwing off everything, because they'd rather put us in a more dangerous position where their liberties are protected than to sacrifice a little bit of their own personal luxuries for the greater good. Very interesting. Continuing. As if the tone of government had been found too high or too rigid, the doctrines they teach are calculated to induce us to depress or to relax it by expedients which, upon other occasions, have been condemned or forborne. So again, he's referencing the Anti-Federalists, saying they are he's essentially repeating what we just discussed. He's trying to get them to give up. He's saying they do not want to give up enough liberties, even though they themselves, at the state level, have said exactly what I'm saying now. Because I'm Hamilton and everyone agrees with me. It may be affirmed without the imputation of invective that if the principles they inculcate on various points could so far obtain as to become the popular creed, they would utterly unfit the people of this country for any species of government whatever. So he's saying the Anti-Federalists have gone to such a point trying to impress the general public that they are claiming that a government should have so little power that it can't even be a government at all. Which, to be fair, some of the Anti-Federalists, their criticisms were very harsh of the national government, though they were pushing to continue the state governments. None of the Anti-Federalists wanted no government. As I said, anarchy was not a political theory at this point. No one was saying that. But he is essentially accusing them of that. Again, as always, Federalists are propaganda. They were trying to convince the reader to vote a certain way. But a danger of this kind is not to be apprehended. Okay, so let's not overlook these dangers. The citizens of America have too much discernment to be argued into anarchy. Now, for anyone coming in late, as I mentioned before, they did use the word anarchy, but it was not a political theory. It was chaos. It was the old-timey version of anarchy. I'm glad I made that note earlier, but I see some people have come in a little bit late. They do not mean it the political idea of anarchy. They mean literal no government, every man for himself, chaos. The citizens of America have too much discernment to be argued into anarchy. But as I was saying, no one thought there should be no government. And he's saying that right here. No one's saying there should be no government. And I am much mistaken if experience has not wrought a deep and solemn conviction in the public mind that greater energy of government is essential to the welfare and prosperity of the community. So a vigorous, more energetic government. Again, here it is. Every week we say it. Energy, energy, energy. It is the word of the day, especially when it comes to Hamilton. Madison uses it too, and George Washington used it in his private letters at this time, trying to convince people to support the Constitution. Energy. He wanted an energetic government that did things, that helped push the economy forward, that helped stimulate the economy, that helped bring a national defense, a standing army. Hamilton wanted a government to do things. I know many of the conservative listeners, modern conservatives, might not love to hear this when it comes to the United States Constitution, but the people pushing the Constitution wanted it to do things. Again, not taking sides, not talking about my personal opinion. We try not to talk about modern politics here, but it is surprising to many nowadays that is one of the main arguments of the Constitution. Take a quick sip of water, because I'm so chatty right now. It may not be amiss in this place concisely to remark the origin and progress of the idea, which aims at the exclusion of military establishments in times of peace. So he's saying we're going to go back to the conversation we had the last 2 weeks about standing armies. What a great time for me to bring up standing armies. Though in speculative minds it may arise from a contemplation of the nature and tendency of such institutions, fortified by the events that have happened in other ages and countries, yet as a national sentiment it must be traced to those habits of thinking which we derive from the nation from whom the inhabitants of these states have in general sprung. So we might not love the idea of standing armies. Some people might not like the ideas of standing armies, but we've all come from Great Britain. He says the nation we've all generally sprung. He's saying Great Britain. Most of us are from Great Britain here. We were about 10 years ago from Great Britain. We still have that in our hearts and minds and our beings, so to speak. So if we want to look back at who we are and who we have been, and why we don't like standing armies, but why we should like standing armies, let's go take a look at the mother country. Oh, what do you know? England. In England, for a long time after the Norman conquest, the authority of the monarch was almost unlimited. All right, I went too far there. So the monarch was essentially a dictator for a long time after the Norman conquest. In 1066, essentially, I'm not going to get too much into that other history, but for Middle Ages England was conquered by kind of the French and the Germans. I can't remember. Were the Normans were Normandy. So they were kind of French, though a little German. It's hard to say. They were like tribal. It wasn't the states of Germany and France as we know them today. But Europe conquered England. We'll say that. And after a while, that is, I believe, when French became the official language of English nobility, because they were being ruled by French people. And that is why France for a very long time was the language of diplomacy throughout Europe. That's why people like John Adams had trouble, because he didn't speak French. But he studied very hard and ended up learning it as an adult, which is difficult. But Jefferson spoke French. William Short spoke French. Most of the men who went over there as diplomats spoke French. 700-800 years later. But Hamilton's saying, back to the point. For a long time, the monarchy was almost unlimited, essentially a dictatorship. Inroads were gradually made upon the prerogative in favor of liberty, first by the barons and afterwards by the people, till the greatest part of its formidable pretensions became extinct. So over time, they would write new laws, and slowly, it wasn't just a dictatorship. Some of the nobility got a little bit of power in controlling the government, and eventually it made its way down till the people themselves didn't. And the history of England is very fascinating in that fashion. And actually, in one of the earlier ones, one of the first, like 7, 8, 9 Federalist papers, I believe it was Hamilton himself who actually references how England was special, the way its history progressed and the way it was able to give its people rights, unlike the rest of Europe. But again, not to digress too much of that. More history lesson. But it was not until the revolution in 1688, which elevated the Prince of Orange to the throne of Great Britain, that English liberty was completely triumphant. So 600 years later, 600 years of slow and steady getting rights for the people, they finally got it. As incident to the undefined power of making war, an acknowledged prerogative of the crown, Charles II. Excuse me, that was just his title. That's not the end of the sentence. Okay. As incident to the undefined power of making war, an acknowledged prerogative of the crown, Charles II had, by his own authority, kept on foot in time of peace a body of 5,000 men. So, even though people had made all their rules and were getting equality under or some power in the government under the crown, there was still a standing army. And this number, James II, increased to 30,000 who were paid out of his civil lists. So over time, James II, who I believe was James of York, who I think New York is actually named after. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure. He increased his power to 30,000 men in a standing army. At the Revolution, to abolish the exercise of so dangerous an authority, it became an article of the Bill of Rights then framed, that, quote, the king raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless with the consent of Parliament, was against the law, end quote. So what he's saying here is, after all these centuries of England slowly weaning power from the monarch to the nobles, to the people, the idea of a standing army did become considered dangerous in England. But even after the Revolution of 1688, the people still understood that there were times you might need a standing army. So even though the king couldn't just raise a standing army all willy-nilly, with the consent of Parliament, the people's representatives could agree with the king and raise an army. And this is essentially what Hamilton was saying last week, what he's further alluding to and elaborating on in Federalist number 26, with the idea that the representatives of the people should have the power to raise a standing army at any time, because you don't, like he said last week, you don't want to wait until after you're invaded before you raise your army. In that kingdom, when the pulse of liberty was at its highest pitch, no security against the danger of standing armies was thought requisite, beyond a prohibition that their being raised or kept up by the mere authority of the executive magistrate. So no one in England, even at that time when they were just fought for their liberty, no one in England thought they get rid of standing armies. They just couldn't let the king raise whatever army he wants. You needed some say from the representatives of the people. The patriots who effected that memorable revolution were too temperate, too well informed to think of any restraint on the legislative discretion. Interesting. Less than 5 years after the war officially ends, throwing off Great Britain, that he's referencing them as patriots. Literally 99 years before he's writing this, referencing people of Great Britain as patriots and saying they were temperate and well-informed, winking at alluding to the idea that the Anti-Federalists were less patriotic than some of the British that they just overthrew, which is a really harsh blow. He's really good at being mean to people. Really subversive. But again, still harping on the same point. They were aware that a certain number of troops for guards and garrisons were indispensable, that no precise bounds could be set to the national there's that word I can't pronounce, exigencies, that a power equal to every possible contingency must exist somewhere in the government, and that when they referred the exercise of that power to the judgment of the legislature, they had arrived at the ultimate point of precaution, which was reconcilable with the safety of the community. So, back then, after they overthrew the king, they knew that there had to be a certain amount of power alluded to wage war. They, as he says here, they had every possible contingency must exist somewhere in the government. There must be a way to protect yourself in any situation. And the best way to do that, according to Hamilton, is to prepare the Congress, the representatives of the people, to raise an army at any time that it feels necessary. Not just to let the president go do it, but to have Congress be able to enact rules and regulations for any possible moment of necessity. From the same source, the people of America may be said to have derived an hereditary impression of the danger to liberty from standing army in times of peace. Yellow, I see your question. I tell you what, stick around. We're not too far from the end here, and I will be happy to answer that particular question. I do want to say real quick, notice it's an hereditary, because most words that start with H used to have an instead of in front of it. I still do that myself, but people call me out on it. From the same source, people may be said to have derived a hereditary impression of danger to liberty. So the American people, we have inherited the same goal from liberty that we had as British people. One of the main reasons the American Revolutionary War broke out is the Patriots were fighting for what they called their rights as Englishmen. I'm not quoting one person. There were hundreds of people who used that phrase throughout the Revolution. They were fighting not for new rights they wanted, but for rights they felt they already had as English persons. And as such, they were a little bit nervous about standing armies. And then the British had a standing army hanging around. That was also fresh on people's minds, was that standing army that led to the Revolutionary War hanging out not just in Boston, but notably in Boston. The circumstances of a revolution quickened the public's sensibility on every point connected with the security of popular rights, and in some instances raised the warmth of our zeal beyond the degree which consisted with the due temperature of the body politic. So leading into the Revolutionary War, were very nervous about the rights of the people. They fought the war and won it and secured these rights, but they were so anxious to secure these rights and so protective of these rights that perhaps they've gone a little bit overboard about holding on to the rights, and it is not within due temperature, as he says here. Maybe it's time to lighten up a little bit. Again, as we said earlier, the point of government is to protect people, and to have a government, the idea of government is you have to give up some of your rights to have a government. Like, for example, if it's illegal to kill people, then you give up your right to kill people by agreeing that everyone else will give up their right to kill people, and only the government can come in and stop people who are killing people. I hope I don't get taken down for using that phrase so many times. It seems like an extreme example of what we're discussing, but it is the primary source of why we have government. We all give up our natural right to kill people as a means of agreeing on government. And it goes further and further. We all give up our natural right to just go into people's house and take their stuff, because that's stealing. And we as a society, most societies throughout history, have agreed that that's kind of a mean way to go about things, to put it gently. But theoretically, we are giving up our right to steal from our neighbors as a member of a society. And he's saying here that, well, we need to reflect on the rights that we're concerned with and how much we can actually give up for the government to proceed. The attempts of two of the states to restrict the authority of the legislature in the article of military establishments are of the number of these instances. So he mentioned before, and in a previous paper, Pennsylvania and North Carolina, in their bills of rights, actually say that it is illegal in that state to have a standing army, at least in times of peace, of course, is what they say. We're not going to get too much into that. We did discuss that last week. Feel free to go back and watch that if you haven't seen it. But that's basically what he's referencing here. The principles which had taught us to be jealous of the power of an hereditary monarch were by an injudicious excess extended to the representatives of the people in their popular assemblies. So, this is an interesting sentence. He's basically saying that we were so angry at the king for not protecting our rights that we got angry at Parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords also. And he's hinting that we should not have gotten angry at the popular assemblies. We should have just been angry at the king. This is a total misrepresentation of what actually happened, especially if you read what the founders wrote to the king, the Olive Branch petition and the First Continental Congress, the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They weren't writing to Parliament saying, hey, save us from the king. They were writing to the king saying, save us from Parliament. So this, I don't know how he thinks this would land on his audience. Again, as always, he's trying to convince an audience to think a certain way. I don't know how they could possibly read this and say, yeah, it was the king I was mad at 5 years ago. That's how I used to feel. Well, okay, that's bad, because 5 years before this, it was the king. The war was coming to an end. 10 years before this, it wasn't the king. It was Parliament. So really interesting how he's saying that it was... Oh, yeah, that's really backwards, Hamilton. Nice try. You did not fool me. Even in some of the states where this error was not adopted, we find unnecessary declarations that standing armies ought not to be kept up in time of peace without the consent of the legislature, in capitals, which is interesting because that's what he had just said they did in Parliament. That was one of the great things about the revolution in England of 1688. But now he seems to be trashing the idea of the state governments doing it on their own. I call them unnecessary because the reason which had introduced a similar provision into the English Bill of Rights is not applicable to any of the state constitutions. So we were really happy when England did it in Parliament, but it doesn't matter to the states. Let's see why not. The power of raising armies at all, under those constitutions, can by no construction be deemed to reside anywhere else than in the legislatures themselves, and it was superfluous, if not absurd, to declare that a matter should not be done without the consent of a body which alone had the power of doing it. Oh, Hamilton. What a guy. So, 100 years before he's writing this, there's the English Revolution, and the people take power from the king. And now the government that has representatives of the people say the king can't raise an army without us doing it. But that doesn't apply to the state governments because they never had a king. So the legislatures were the only ones who could ever raise that body. So what does it matter whether or not the legislature has consent with or without the consent of the legislature? The legislature is the only place that could ever raise it. Kind of ignoring the idea that they had governors who were the chief executives, and while certainly not monarchs, were the commanding generals, so to speak, of the state militias. So the governor could pretty much just call in the militia and rename it an army pretty easily. Not pretty easily, I shouldn't say pretty easily. In certain states it was fairly easy, in other ones it wasn't. He's talking actually trash about Pennsylvania and North Carolina, where it was very difficult for the governor to try and do something like that. To be fair, Pennsylvania, and for a while, although this was changing, they were already planning on changing this in New Hampshire, they didn't have governors, to be fair. They had Supreme Executive Councils, which was a group of people on essentially a board that ran the state. So I guess he's not 100% wrong in all the situations, but he is wrong in some of the situations. So, but let's continue. Accordingly, in some of these constitutions, and among others, in that of this state of New York, which had been justly celebrated both in Europe and America as one of the best forms of government established in this country, there was a total silence upon the subject. So when I was saying before about governors, I had New York in mind. I am from New York. He's writing in New York. I've been reading a lot of Anti-Federalist papers written in New York, so my study of the last year or so has been largely based on the study of New York State. So, but he say here, everyone in Europe and America loves New York, but they say nothing about a standing army. And it's like, yeah, so you're point is mute. They absolutely could have raised a standing. George Clinton probably could have raised a standing army if he wanted to. I don't know if this is the paper where he goes directly into New York and that. I don't believe so. It is remarkable that even in the two states which seem to have mediated an interdiction of military establishments in time of peace, the mode of expression made use of its rather cautionary than prohibitory. It's more cautionary than prohibitory. I went a little too far, but basically, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, they say in times of peace. He's about to get that. It's not that you can't ever do it. It's that you should try your best not to. It is not said that standing armies shall not be kept up, but that they ought not be kept up in time of peace. And again, this is something he went over last week. This ambiguity in terms appears to have been the result of a conflict between jealousy and conviction, between the desire of excluding such establishments at all events and the persuasion that an absolute exclusion would be unsafe and unwise. So basically, the people really wanted to not have a standing army, but they also knew to never have a standing army meant you just get invaded sometimes. Okay, he's going to ask himself some questions as he likes to do. Can it be doubted that such a provision, whenever the situation of public affairs was understood to require a departure from it, would be interpreted by the legislature as a mere admonition and would be made to yield to the necessities or supposed necessities of the state? So essentially, if you did say you could never have a standing army, eventually you'd have to disobey the Constitution as not to get invaded. Let the fact already mentioned with respect to Pennsylvania. So let's look at Pennsylvania. What then, may it be asked, is the use of such a provision if it ceased to operate the moment there is an inclination to disregard it? So what's the point of having this if you're just going to get rid of it as soon as there's any conflict on the horizon whatsoever? One more sip. Okie doke. There's a real deep throat there for a second. Where is it? Where's the end here? Let us examine whether there be any comparison in point of efficacy between the provision alluded to and that which is contained in the new Constitution for restraining the appropriations of money for military purposes for the period of 2 years. So, let's compare the state governments to the Constitution when it comes to this particular discussion. And he does point out here what he mentioned in previous papers, that at least at the time, Congress constitutionally was only allowed to appropriate money for the military for 2 years. And that, he argued, was a major limiting factor on the growth of a standing army too quickly to do tyrannical things with. The former, by aiming at too much, is calculated to effect nothing. The latter, by steering clear of an imprudent extreme and by being perfectly compatible with a proper provision for the this is just that word, man. The exigencies of the nation, will have a salutary and powerful operation. So, the state governments, at least the ones that say you can't have a standing army, they will do nothing. The whole point is to get nothing done. But under the Constitution, not only is it there to get done whatever you need, whenever you need it, but it won't get out of hand because it can only be paid for up to 2 years, which will help limit it from getting out of hand. Allegedly. The legislature of the United States will be obliged by this provision once at least in every 2 years to deliberate upon the propriety of keeping a military force on foot, to come to new resolution on the point, and to declare their sense of the matter by a formal vote in the face of their constituents. So this is a lot of fun, especially because we don't talk about modern politics here. But essentially he's saying that every 2 years, the representatives of the people of the United States will have to stand up in front of the American people, agree or disagree on to why they believe there should be more or less military. They will have to make a resolution and they will have to vote publicly, and we will have to see what everyone decides, what they cast their vote for, and we will be given the opportunity to vote for or against these constituents in their next election cycle. I'm sorry, these representatives in their next election cycle. That is the point of this 2-year term of appropriations, aka paying for the military. I don't remember, again, we don't talk about modern politics, but we don't ever see them. They don't anymore. No one knows. They are not at liberty to vest in the executive department permanent funds for the support of the army, if they were even incautious enough to be willing to repose it in so improper a confidence. So, according to Alexander Hamilton, Congress cannot simply give the government, the president, a permanent amount of money to support an army or do whatever he wants with militarily or forcefully, if they were ever incautious enough to be willing to do so improper a thing. Man, it's really hard for me not to make modern politics jokes while we're reading through this. Thanks, Hamilton. You were really right about that. As the spirit of party in different degrees must be expected to infect all political bodies, there will be, no doubt, persons in the national legislature willing enough to arrange... Ooh, excuse me, sorry about that. Hamilton makes me sneeze. While there will be political parties, there will be no doubt persons in the national legislature willing enough to arraign the measures and incriminate the views of the majority. So there will be party politics, as James Madison discussed in earlier papers. There's no way around it. There will be party politics, and there will be people in the legislature trying to get the majority party to do certain not so great things. The provision for the support of a military force will always be a favorable topic for declamation. So, very interesting. He's saying that something people will always be able to publicly do is say we're spending too much on the military. Yeah, that's definitely something you hear people say all the time nowadays. As often as the question comes forward, the public attention will be roused and attracted to the subject by the party in opposition. And if the majority should be really disposed to exceed their proper limits, the community will be warned of the danger and will have an opportunity of taking measures to guard against it. So, if the majority party really does want to spend too much money on the military, well, the minority party will tell everyone about it, and the people will be so up in arms. I can't believe they want to do this. Well, I guess they'll just have to elect the people out who want to spend too much on the military. I'm sorry if I'm coming off as sarcastic. I really try to be unbiased here, but I do live in the world. Independent parties in the national legislature itself, as often as the period of discussion arrived, the state legislatures, who will always be not only vigilant, but suspicious and jealous guardians of the rights of the citizens against encroachment from the federal government, will consistently have their attention awake to the conduct of national rulers. It will be ready enough, if anything improper appears, to sound the alarm of the people, and not only to be the voice, but if necessary, the arm of their discontent. So essentially what he's saying here, the state governments, since they will not be part of national parties, of course, there's no way that the state governments will have the same parties as the national government. That'll never happen. When people discuss whether or not we should raise or lower the military budget, the state governments will look out for the will of the people, because, again, they have nothing to do with the federal parties. So they will protect the rights of the citizens. Of course, I do want to note that Hamilton, at this point, is still almost a year away from admitting that maybe we need a Bill of Rights. He didn't think we needed a Bill of Rights. He didn't think the states should be able to defend themselves from the federal government, as he's argued in previous papers, because the federal government needs to put down these very insurrections that might arise within the states. But, you know, the states will be the arm of the people, of course. They will be able to awake to the national rulers. Yeah, if anything improper appears, then the states will go take over, right? Again, Hamilton has previously argued that a disobedient state should be suppressed by the national government, and here he is saying, well, no, they'll be able to stand up to the government. Great, thanks, man. All right, I'm gonna have one more sip of water. We're gonna finish this up. If you can't tell from my voice, Hamilton, this entire paragraph is wrong. He was just wrong. Just objectively wrong. We don't have to get into the details of modern politics to realize that literally everything Hamilton said in this entire statement proved not to be true. It's wrong. Anyway, let's see if he gets something right. Schemes to subvert the liberty of the great community... He's really gotten to me. Schemes to subvert the liberties of a great community require time to mature them for execution. So if you are going to subvert, if you are going to oppress the great majority of people in the United States, it will take a long time. But we only appropriate money for 2 years to the army. An army so large as seriously to menace those liberties could only be formed by progressive augmentations, which would suppose not merely a temporary combination between the legislature and the executive, but a continual conspiracy for a series of time. So, essentially, not only would the legislature and the Congress and the president have to come together to try and subvert the people, they would have to do this for a very long time. Like, I don't know, a couple hundred years. Great. Is it probable that such a combination would exist at all? He's asking him questions. Is it probable that it would be preserved in and transmitted along through all the successive variations in a representative body, which biannual elections would naturally produce in both houses? Well, they only have biannual elections in one house, Hammy. Is it presumable that every man, the instant he took his seat in the National Senate or House of Representatives, would commence a traitor to his constituents and to his country? Man, I wish he was alive today. All right. Oh, can it be supposed that there would not be found one man discerning enough to detect so atrocious a conspiracy, or bold or honest enough to appraise his constituents of the danger? So here, he's just going through, is it possible that not even, of all the people elected to Congress, not one of them is a decent person? That not one of them is corrupted by money and power the minute they get there? Not one of them? I can't imagine a world where that's possible. Great. Can it be supposed that not one person would stand up and tell the constituents about the problems going on? To be fair, not everyone elected to Congress today is a terrible person who's immediately corrupted. But like out of 435 people, you have like 6 or 7 who are not corrupted. And yeah, they are doing what Hamilton said. Yeah, there's a handful of them out there saying, hey, there's some major problems here. And we just never see them. You never hear. You got to really look for those people. So, great, Ham. Yeah, there are 1 or 2 who are doing their best. Thanks. If such presumptions can be fairly be made, there ought to at once be an end to all delegated authority. So, if essentially saying, if everyone in Congress, if you really believe, I'm using sarcasm because he used sarcasm. He's being sarcastic. If you really believe that everyone in Congress is going to be corrupted, if you really think that everyone who goes to represent the country is going to want to just take all the money and send it to the army. Well, then we should just get rid of all authority together. We should just stop delegating authority. Okay. Oh, we would, Hamilton, but you've made it very difficult. Your Constitution has made it very I mean, I don't want to talk that bad about the Constitution, but the Constitution you've helped push has made it very difficult to just end delegated authority. Thanks, bud, for such an easy resolution to the problem. The people should resolve to recall all the powers they have hitherto parted with out of their own hands, and to divide themselves into as many states as there are counties, in order that they may be able to manage their own concerns in person. So the people should just dissolve the federal government and dissolve the states into counties, which, I mean, honestly doesn't sound so bad. All right, I'm going to need to sip my water real quick. He's got me all hot and bothered, this one. This is the first, I think this is the first Anti-Federalist where I'm like a little bit agitated at what I'm actually reading. Because of how, like, I live in the world today, and his predictions are so abominably inaccurate in this particular discussion that it's hard not to get mad at. If such suppositions could even be reasonably made, still the concealment of the design for any duration would be impractical. So even if you think everyone elected is going to come together to try and build this big army and suppress the people of the United States, it would be really hard for them to hide it. Yeah, they don't try and hide it. It would be announced by the very circumstance of augmenting the army to so great an extent of profound peace. Yes, it is announced. They just announce it. What colorable reason could be assigned in a country so situated for such vast augmentations of the military force? What could they possibly say to convince the people to support a government that just keeps putting all its money into the military and not anywhere else? It is impossible that the people could be long deceived, and the destruction of the project of the projectors would quickly follow the discovery. Yes, Hamilton, it would be so easy for the people to revolt and throw off the government that you literally said you created to make sure the people couldn't throw it off. I mean, you read Madison's Number 10, probably the most famous Federalist paper, where Madison is out there simply saying, don't worry, rich people, we're not going to have a tyranny of the majority, which on first glance, and you can look back at our reading of this we did a while back, first glance, tyranny of the majority sounds like, oh good, we're not going to have minorities be suppressed by the majority. But no, Madison outright says, don't worry, minority, we're not going to let the people tell the elites what to do. And it is impossible that the people could long be deceived. And the destruction of the project and the projectors would quickly follow. He's saying that we're just going to we're just going to say, no, stop. Government, please stop. We don't want you to spend all of our money on the military. Okay. And again, if this is the first one you're watching, I'm not trying to sound like I'm anti-military or anything. In fact, the last two discussions, I acknowledge Hamilton made very compelling arguments for why a standing army should exist. And I'm not necessarily against the standing army part of this discussion. I am against the, brazen, oh, don't worry, Congress is gonna be fine arguments. And again, that's only because I, can turn on the news any day of the week in modern America and see that while we don't talk about modern politics, it's we're not having a very good go of it right now. It has been said that the provision which limits the appropriation of money for the support of an army to the period of 2 years would be unavailing, because the executive, when once possessed of a force large enough to awe the people into submission, would find resources in that very force sufficient to enable him to dispense with supplies from the acts of the legislature. So he's saying here that Anti-Federalists have claimed that once Congress makes a provision of 2 years appropriates money for 2 years. Now the president has an army. And once he has a big enough army that's already been provided for, he can use that army to keep it going and will no longer need money from Congress. He can use the army to make his own money. But the question again recurs, upon what pretense could he be put in possession of a force of that magnitude in time of peace? Okay, so why would we give the federal government that size of an army in peacetime? We can get one in wartime. If we suppose it to have been created in consequence of some domestic insurrection or foreign war, then it becomes a case not within the principle of the objection, for this is leveled against the power of keeping up troops in time of peace. Again, he says it right here. If this be in consequence of some domestic insurrection. That's his way of saying internal rebellion. So if the people say, hey, we don't want you to spend all this money on the army, well, we're going to have to raise an army. Well, we've already raised the army. Wait 2 years and elect us out. In the meantime, here's our executive with the army to suppress your insurrection. Then it becomes a case of not within the principle of objection, but power of keeping up troops in times of peace. So we've discussed this in the past, the idea of keeping up troops in peacetime. Few persons will be so visionary as to seriously to contend that military forces ought not to be raised to quell a rebellion or resist an invasion. And if the defense of the community under such circumstances should make it necessary to have an army so numerous as to hazard its liberty, this is one of those calamities for which there is neither preventative nor cure. So, if neither preventative nor cure. So what he's saying here is if we need an army either to quell a rebellion, so like literally if we need an army to suppress the will of the people, or to resist an invasion, and we need to raise an army so big that it gets rid of the people's liberties, it happens. Sometimes it happens. Oh well, nothing we can do. Literally, like it's one of those calamities which there is neither preventative nor cure. Nothing we can do. Sometimes we gotta get rid of everyone's liberties so we can quell a rebellion. Okay. He's literally not answering the question he asked himself. He asked himself the question, what if a president has an army and doesn't want to give it up? What if he gets too big an army and doesn't need payment from Congress anymore? Oh well, nothing we can do. It cannot be provided against by any possible form of government. It might even result from a simple league, offensive and defensive, if it should ever be necessary for the Confederates or Allies to form an army for common defense. He's saying no government can protect you from that. If you want a government to protect you, sometimes it has to be able to get rid of your liberties. And sometimes while we get rid of your liberties, we have to build a gigantic army and put the president in power and, maybe he'll be able to fund it himself without Congress having to pay for it. Maybe, who knows? There's nothing we can do. Sometimes you got to suppress a rebellion from within, right? Great. And again, I read a lot of Anti-Federalist papers, so if you see the frustration coming out in my voice, again, this is what New York was afraid of. Like, he's writing to the people of New York, and the people of New York are overwhelmingly Anti-Federalist. And this is what they're saying. They're like, this guy's losing his mind. What do you mean? Oh, might get rid of our liberties. Whoopsie daisy. But it is an evil infinitely less likely to attend us in a united. Okay, sorry. Side note. Remember before I said "an" historical? They use the word "an." This should be "an" united. Okay. Anyway, continue. That's pet peeve of mine. But it is an evil infinitely less likely to attend us in a united than in a disunited state. Nay, it may be safely asserted that it is an evil altogether unlikely to attend us in this latter situation. So, the ability to did I skip a sentence? Can I be provided for? Oh, I did skip a sentence. Whoops. It cannot be provided for against any. Oh no, I said that can't be provided for by any government. But this evil, which evil? Oh, the evil of having your liberties eliminated. It's less likely that this will happen, that your liberties will be taken away in a united nation than a disunited one. In fact, it is safer under the national government than under the state governments. Of course it is. It is not easy to conceive a possibility that danger so formidable can assail the whole Union as to demand a force considerable enough to place our liberties in the least jeopardy, especially if we take into our view the aid to be derived from the militia, which ought always to be counted upon as valuable and powerful auxiliary. It is not easy to conceive so formidable. It's not easy to conceive a possibility that danger so formidable can assail the whole Union. Hamilton can't, in his mind, possibly fathom a situation where you would need to mobilize the entirety of the United States. He can't conceive of World War I. It's not easy. It's not easy for him to conceive World War I. Which, mind you, was 110 years after his death. Which, mind you, we are 110 years from World War I. Put some context on it. He was as far away from World War I as we are. He saw the innovations. They knew that steam power was being developed. They knew that the Industrial Revolution was coming. They knew that weapons were getting enhanced. He knew this. The idea that he couldn't predict a war so gigantic. The revolution itself broke out around the world. The French and Indian War, as we call it in America, was the 7 Years' War. It was what Chamberlain called the First World War. It should have been super easy for him to conceive of a danger so formidable they would need to unite the whole force. And he outlines here, well, we have the militia if that were to happen. If that were to happen, we have the militia. Which, again, the federal government can just take the state militia and assume it. One of the things the Anti-Federalist argued was, why can you just take the state militia when you seem to need it? And at the same time, he didn't want the Bill of Rights, so he didn't care for the militia in the Second Amendment. But in a state of disunion, as has been fully shown in another place, the contrary of this supposition would become not only probable, but almost unavoidable. The idea that we would need to, okay, so without the United States Constitution, the state governments would pretty much definitely find a situation where they needed to mobilize the force of the whole state to fight in a war, and therefore find itself in a situation where the governor supposedly has all this power and they would suppress the liberties, even though earlier in this paper he said that that could never happen because the state governments, many of them, were run by the legislature. He's all over the place, man. He makes you think. Nick, yeah, welcome to the party, Nick. Oof. Oof. Publius. Oof. I don't even know. I don't even remember where he started this paper. Like, he's just all over the place. I'm going to do a brief run through. I'm going to do it a little different this week. He wants to talk about the difference between power and privilege. It's not his greatest work, Nick. Ah, man, it makes me angry. For anyone watching later, I do shoot these live. Feel free to come Tuesdays to the live video. One more sip of water. Do a little review for anyone who came in late. This is tough. Of all my I feel like this is one of the few times I've I don't want to say I've lost my cool. I'm not screaming and shouting, but I assume I am visibly frustrated with this particular paper. He talks about power and privilege. The essence of this paper, power means giving power to the government, and privilege is your rights, and finding the balance between giving power to the government and withholding rights for the people. And yeah, I know. Well, I gotta get blood work in the morning. I can't eat or drink anything now. All right, I'm gonna pull myself back up, big screen it. Let me unblur real quick. Real quick here. Okay, how's that? Is that better? Great, great. All right. Federalist number 26. I just finished Federalist number 26. It is one of the most frustrating Federalist papers I can remember. He talks about power versus privilege, aka giving power to the government versus people withholding the rights. Alexander Hamilton talks at length about how he thinks people have become too jealous of their rights. He thinks that the idea of government is that you have to give up a little bit of rights for the betterment of the whole, which is the basis of government, and that government's primary concern is the safety of the individual, which is fair. That being said, he thinks the Anti-Federalists have grabbed on way too hard to their particular rights. It's lagging a bit. All right, Nick, I'll come back. Take a pause. It's because I hit record. Stopping recording. Oh, it doesn't want to stop. I'll give it a second. Okay. Hopefully it's better in a sec. Of course. I made changes trying to make it look better for you guys, and that messed up last week. This week was fine, but now I hit record while I was doing it, and obviously that did not go well. Hopefully it's working. It looks like it's giving me trouble. Let me know, Nick. Let me know when it comes back. I'll wait on you. See if it can fix. I'll give you the rundown. So you came in a little late, so I'll give you the rundown. No, and it's done. Okay. Well, screwed it up right at the end. Of course. Let's continue. Basically, we had some trouble. Rights versus privilege. Hamilton goes off on all these tangents, saying how there's no way you'll ever conceive where the people elected to the government. Man, I did this again. All right, let me make it not blurry. Man, it was a good video till now, I think. Although, no, probably most people probably left due to my frustration. Okay. Problem is I need a better computer. All right. He gets upset. Federalists, he's talking about power versus privilege. There's anger between each other. It's great. It's great. He just doesn't think there's a world where people in Congress can be corrupted as soon as they get there, and that they'll put all their money into a powerful army and disobey the rights of the people. So there's that. With that, obviously, audio is good, but no camera. All right, thank you, Yellow. Thank you very much. Now, as for your question before, the camera will catch up, I presume. As for your question before, do you know what the literacy rate was during the founding and how much of a factor to play when deciding who should vote? Oh man, I hope my camera starts working again for you. It looks like it won't. It looks like it's giving us trouble. But literacy was extremely high during the American Revolution. It's a common misconception that there was poor literacy at the time. The truth was everyone had to read the Bible. So it was like 90+% literacy rates in the United States during most of the colonial period and through the Revolution. Many of the colonies were founded on religion, and those religions wanted you to read the Bible. In fact, one of the major roles women played in the revolution is that they were the primary educators in the household, and they gave many of the it was up to mothers to teach the children how to read, primarily so they could read the Bible, but that of course extended into all facets of life. Now of course women didn't have the roles in society that they would have today. It was a different time. There was certainly some what we would consider backwards. There were many things we would consider backwards today. But to say, often it said, well, women were suppressed and they didn't have any role. That's not true. Women had a gigantic role in society in a wide variety of ways. And the most important one was education. Most people were educated in the home. They were usually educated by their mother, and everyone could read. Of course, like I said, it was primarily because of the Bible, but it's usually important. When it came to deciding who to vote, no, that was money, dude. Money, 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 money. Things have not changed. And I could get into a whole thing about the history of voting in America. Of course, most of that doesn't come through the American Revolution, but a lot of it starts during the American Revolution. I mean, you even have Thomas Jefferson writing against or getting rid of, or being one of the founders who helps get rid of primogeniture and entail, which essentially said, like, if you're the oldest son of someone with property, then you inherit that property and you can vote. And the other sons were like, why? why? Why can't I vote too if my big brother can vote? And that starts ending to the American Revolution. Now I know to a vast variety of communities in the United States today that is not nearly enough, but that's how the ball got rolling in the United States. During this time, there were certain free black men who achieved the right to vote. It was very rare, and to be fair, after the Constitution was written and there were certain rebellions, those rights were generally rolled back. But the opportunities were starting to arise. Eventually, and I can speak particularly in New York, that by 1780, by 1840, after Stephen Van Rensselaer dies, when his son takes over, New York, as I love to say, was essentially a feudal manor style system well after the American Revolution ended, and just a handful of really rich people owned all the land. And yeah, there was some slaves there, but New York gets rid of slaves fairly quickly, or at least begins the gradual emancipation of slaves fairly quickly. But all of the white dudes who were farmers there didn't own their land. They rented it and were more or less serfs to the land. And after you hear tales of freedom, they start saying, no, we want to be able to vote too. That's garbage. And it wasn't until Stephen Van Rensselaer dies in 1840 and his son takes over, and Stephen Van Rensselaer didn't really collect all the rents that were owed to him, but his son comes around and wants to collect the rents. And there are the rent riots in New York. And that sets off a chain of events where eventually all free men in New York were given the right to vote. And that took 60 years from the American Revolution to happen. So, again, is very gradual, but that's a momentous change because, 8 years later, you have the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, where women are famously issue their, I forget the name of the Seneca Falls, the Women's Rights, Declaration of Rights. I found it. Women's Declaration of Rights, I believe, is what it's called, of 1848. The next decade and a half, New York becomes an important part of the Underground Railroad. Eventually, Civil War, slaves were liberated in the South. I'm not going to get into all of voting rights history.